Good evening and welcome back to the Quiet Library. Tonight, I'd like to introduce you to a man who spent much of his life thinking about something surprisingly familiar. Not war, not politics, not even philosophy itself. He wondered, why do our minds so often suffer before anything has actually happened? Why do we imagine conversations that never take place? Fear futures that never arrive, and lose sleep over events that may never come at all. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca. History remembers him simply as Seneca. He lived nearly 2,000 years ago, yet many of the questions that filled his mind still often fill ours today. Seneca was born around the year 4 BCE in the Roman city of Corduba, in what is now Cordoba, Spain. At the time, it was one of the most prosperous cities in the western provinces of the Roman Empire. His father was an accomplished writer and teacher of rhetoric. Education mattered deeply within the family. Books, language, ideas, these were not luxuries. They were part of everyday life. While still a young boy, Seneca was brought to Rome. Imagine arriving there for the first time, a city unlike any other on earth, more than 1 million people, markets filled with voices from across the empire, temples, libraries, public baths, marble buildings glowing in the afternoon sun, ships arriving daily with grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, silk carried from lands far beyond Rome's eastern frontiers. For a curious child, it must have felt as though the entire world had gathered in one place. Like Marcus Aurelius, after him, Seneca received an outstanding education. He studied rhetoric, grammar, literature, law, but it was philosophy that captured his imagination the most. Not because it promised success, but because it promised something much more difficult: inner peace. Among his teachers were philosophers from several different schools of thought. The Romans admired Greek philosophy deeply, and young Seneca absorbed ideas from Stoics, Cynics, and others as he searched for the kind of person he hoped to become. Even as a young man, he was known for asking difficult questions, not only about the world, but about himself. How much of our unhappiness comes from reality, and how much comes from our thoughts? It is an extraordinary question, one that modern psychologists continue to explore today using different language and scientific methods. Seneca, of course, did not have neuroscience. He had no brain scans, no controlled experiments, no psychology journals. What he did have was a remarkable ability to observe human nature. He watched people worry, he watched people chase wealth, he watched ambition transform good people into anxious people. He watched success fail to satisfy those who had spent their entire lives pursuing it. And quietly, he began reaching a conclusion. Perhaps peace depends less upon what happens to us and more upon the stories we tell ourselves about what might happen to us. It is a thought worth carrying with us tonight. Because before Seneca became a famous philosopher, before he advised emperors, before he wrote books that would survive for centuries, he was simply just another young man, trying to understand why the human mind can become its own greatest source of suffering. And perhaps that is where every thoughtful life begins. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. Outside, the streets of Rome slowly grow quieter. The evening breeze carries distant voices through the city. Oil lamps begin appearing one by one behind open windows. Somewhere, a young student closes another scroll, looks up at the evening sky, and wonders whether wisdom begins not by changing the world, but by learning to understand the mind itself. Tonight, our journey with Seneca begins there. As Seneca entered adulthood, his reputation grew quickly. He was intelligent, articulate, a gifted speaker, no doubt. In ancient Rome, those qualities could open many doors. Public speaking was not simply an admired skill, it was one of the foundations of political life. A well delivered speech could influence the Senate, defend a friend, or shape the future of the empire. Seneca possessed that gift. People listened when he spoke. His writings began to circulate. His influence quietly expanded. But life has a way of changing direction without warning. In the year 41st CE, a new emperor came to power. His name was Claudius. Not long afterward, Seneca found himself accused of adultery with Julia Livilla, a member of the imperial family. Whether those accusations were true or not, it remains uncertain. Ancient historians disagree, and political rivalries within the Roman court make it difficult to separate fact from rumor. What we do know is this: Seneca was convicted. His sentence was exile. He was sent to the island of Corsica. Imagine the journey. One day, you are standing in the heart of Rome, surrounded by libraries, political debates, friends, students, the endless movement of one of the world's greatest cities. Soon afterward, you find yourself on a rocky Mediterranean island, far from the life you once knew and cherished. Corsica was, of course, beautiful. Mountains rose above dense forests. The sea surrounded the island in every direction. But beauty does not always ease loneliness. For nearly 8 years, Seneca remained there, cut off from the political life that had once defined him. Many people would have seen exile as the end of everything, but for Seneca, it became an unexpected classroom. He wrote, he reflected, he questioned his own ambitions. What truly matters when titles disappear? Who are we when no one is watching? Can a person still live well? When life unfolds differently than they hoped. These were not abstract philosophical puzzles. They became deeply personal. Modern psychology often speaks about resilience, the human capacity to adapt after unexpected loss or change. Seneca did not use that word, but he spent years exploring the same idea through his own experience. How do we rebuild a meaningful life when circumstances suddenly change? His answer was neither simply nor easily. He did not pretend exile was pleasant. He missed Rome. He missed conversation. He missed the life he had known. Stoicism was never about denying reality. It was about meeting reality honestly, without allowing despair to become permanent. As the years passed, Seneca continued reading, writing, and thinking. Sometimes our greatest periods of growth arrive not during success, but during interruption. History is filled with remarkable people whose lives changed because events forced them to pause. Exile slowed Seneca's life, and perhaps it deepened it. Then, after nearly 8 years, everything changed once again. A message arrived. A message arrived from Rome. Seneca had been invited to return. A new chapter of his life was about to begin, one that would place him closer to power than he had ever imagined, and would test his philosophy in ways he could never have anticipated. When Seneca returned to Rome, he stepped into a city that had changed. The empire was still quite vast. Its roads still stretched across continents, its ports still welcomed ships from distant shores. But within the imperial palace, a quiet struggle for influence was unfolding. The woman who summoned Seneca back was Agrippina, one of the most powerful figures in Roman history. She had an ambitious plan. Her young son, Nero, was expected to become emperor. He would need an education worthy of ruling the Roman Empire. For that task, she chose Seneca. Imagine being entrusted with the education of a future emperor, not simply teaching grammar or public speaking or law, but helping shape the character of someone who might one day command millions of lives. History rarely offers responsibilities greater than that. At first, there was reason for hope. The young Nero was intelligent, curious, creative. He enjoyed poetry, music, and the arts. When he became emperor in year 54 CE, he was only 17 years old. Because of his youth and inexperience, much of the day-to-day governing was guided by Seneca and the commander of the guard, Sextus Afranius Burrus. Many historians describe Nero's early reign as comparatively stable. Taxes were moderated, some judicial reforms were introduced, public life remained relatively orderly. To many Romans, it seemed that wisdom and political power might finally be working together. For Seneca, this must have felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. After years in exile, he was no longer merely observing history. He was helping shape it. Yet, history often reminds us that influence is not the same as control. As Nero grew older, he became increasingly determined to govern without restraint. The advice that had once been welcomed was now less appreciated. Seneca encouraged moderation, reflection, and patience, and Nero increasingly preferred admiration, absolute authority, and fewer voices willing to challenge him. It raises an uncomfortable question. Can wisdom truly change another person if that person no longer wishes to listen? It is a question parents ask, teachers ask, friends ask, psychologists ask. How much influence can one human being really have over another? Modern psychology suggests that guidance can shape development, especially early in life, but every person still makes choices. Character is influenced by many forces: family, experience, temperament, opportunity, and the decisions we make ourselves. No teacher, however gifted, can live another person's life for them. Seneca understood this more deeply with each passing year. He remained one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Rome. His speeches were admired, his writings continued, his reputation spread across the empire. Yet beneath the surface, the political climate was changing. The palace became increasingly dangerous. Trust became fragile. Fear quietly entered conversations. For a philosopher who believed that reason should guide human behavior, it must have been heartbreaking to watch reason gradually lose its place at the center of power. Still, Seneca continued writing. Perhaps because writing allowed him to preserve the ideals that politics could not always protect. Perhaps because books can sometimes reach people long after rulers have been forgotten. The years ahead would test him more severely than exile ever had. Soon, Seneca would have to answer a question that many thoughtful people eventually face. What should we do when our values no longer fit the world around us? That question would define the final chapter of his life. As the years passed, the distance between Seneca and Nero continued to grow. The young emperor, who had once listened carefully to his teacher, was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Ancient historians describe a court filled with suspicion, rivalries, and fear. Not every account agrees on every detail, and historians continue to debate aspects of Nero's reign, but there is broad agreement on one point. Life close to absolute power was rarely safe. For Seneca, every day became a careful balance. How could he remain loyal to the empire without compromising the principles that had guided his life? Eventually, he made a quiet request. He asked Nero for permission to retire from public life. He also offered to return much of the immense wealth and prosperity he had accumulated while serving at court. Whether Seneca hoped to simplify his life or simply to remove himself from an increasingly dangerous political world, we cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that he wanted distance from power. His request was not fully granted. Although he withdrew from many public duties, he remained closely associated with the emperor himself. And in Rome, association alone could be dangerous. Freed from much of his political work, Seneca devoted more time to writing. Many of the works that survive today were written during these later years. Among them were the letters to Lucilius, not dry philosophical treatises, but deeply personal reflections addressed to his friend. In those letters, Seneca explored questions that still feel remarkably familiar today. How should we spend the limited time we have? Why do anger and fear so easily take hold of us? Can wealth ever truly satisfy the human spirit? What does it mean to live well? If tomorrow is never guaranteed, his answers were rarely dramatic. Instead, they invited quiet reflection. He reminded his readers that time, not money, status, or possessions, is life's most precious resource. Once a day has passed, no emperor can buy it back. No philosopher can recover it. No ordinary person can reclaim it. Perhaps that is why Seneca urged people to live deliberately, not hurriedly, not carelessly, but with attention. Modern psychology reaches similar conclusions through different methods. Research on well being often suggests that people who intentionally focus on what they value rather than constantly chasing what comes next report greater life satisfaction. The language has changed over 2,000 years. The research methods have changed as well, but some of the questions remain strikingly familiar. As Seneca wrote, Rome continued to change around him. Political tensions deepened, rumors spread through the city, trust became increasingly scarce. He had spent much of his life studying uncertainty. Now he was living inside it. Yet his writings remained calm, measured, patient. Reading them today, it is difficult to imagine that many were written by a man who knew his own future had become uncertain. Perhaps that is one of the quietest lessons Seneca offers us. Wisdom does not remove uncertainty. It teaches us how to live alongside it. Before long, events beyond Seneca's control would arrive at his doorstep. And he would face the greatest test of everything he had spent a lifetime teaching. Good evening has long since given way to night. The streets of Rome are quieter now. Most homes are lit only by the gentle glow of oil lamps. Somewhere, a baker is already preparing dough for tomorrow morning. A watchman walks slowly along the city walls. The empire continues, unaware that one of its greatest philosophers is approaching the final chapter of his life. In the year 65 CE, Rome was shaken by what became known as the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot to assassinate Emperor Nero. Whether the conspiracy ever had a realistic chance of succeeding, historians still debate. Many people were accused. Some almost certainly took part. Others may have been swept into the investigation through fear, rumor, or political suspicion. Among those accused was Seneca. To this day, no historian can say with complete certainty whether he had any direct involvement. The ancient sources disagree, and much of what we know comes from writers who lived in a world where politics often shaped the historical record. What seems most likely is that Nero no longer trusted the man who had once been his teacher. And in imperial Rome, losing an emperor's trust could be fatal. an imperial order was delivered. Seneca was instructed to end his own life. For Roman aristocrats, forced suicide was sometimes imposed instead of public execution. It was not a choice in the way we think of choices today. It was a sentence. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, Seneca met that sentence with remarkable composure. His friends gathered around him. His wife, Paulina, refused to leave his side. He spoke with those present not about revenge, not about bitterness, but about the principles he had spent his entire life trying to understand. How much of Tacitus's account reflects Seneca's exact words? We cannot know. Ancient historians often reconstructed speeches to convey the spirit of an event rather than recorded every sentence word by word. But whether every detail unfolded exactly as described or not, the broader picture remains extraordinary. A man who had written for decades about mortality was finally forced to confront his own. Seneca had often reminded his readers that death was not the opposite of life, it was part of life, not something to obsess over, but something that gave meaning to every ordinary day. Because our time is limited. Every conversation matters, every act of kindness matters, every quiet evening matters. That idea still resonates today. Modern psychology generally finds that thoughtfully acknowledging our own mortality can help people clarify their priorities and appreciate the present more deeply. The methods differ, the vocabulary differs, but the underlying insight is surprisingly familiar. Our awareness that life is not infinite can encourage us to live more intentionally. After Seneca's death, the Roman Empire continued. New emperors came. Old monuments crumbled, roads shifted, borders changed. The palace, where so many decisions were made, eventually disappeared into history. Yet something unexpected survived. Not Nero's commands, not political victories, not court intrigues. What endured were the writings of a philosopher. His letters crossed centuries, his essays crossed continents. Readers who would never see ancient Rome would still hear Seneca's voice, quietly reminding them that the greatest victories are often the ones no one else can see. The victory over needless fear, over uncontrolled anger, over the endless desire for more. Perhaps that is why, 2,000 years later, we still find ourselves returning to his words. But not because he lived a perfect life. He did not. Not because history offers simple heroes. It rarely does. But because, like all of us, he spent lifetime trying to answer difficult questions. And in doing so, he left behind something more enduring than power. He left behind a conversation, one that still continues whenever someone opens one of his books or spends a quiet evening reflecting on what it truly means to live well. Thank you for visiting the Quiet Library tonight. Another volume is already waiting on the shelves. Until then, may your thoughts grow a little quieter today. May your rest be peaceful, and may curiosity continue to guide you. Good night.